Why do some problems not come like a storm, but like a slow poison? Why is it that some people are not destroyed suddenly, but gradually weakened, redirected, and quietly diverted from their true path? What if the greatest danger in your life is not the attack you can see, but the one that enters silently and waits? There are battles that announce themselves. You see them, you feel them, you respond to them, but there are other battles far more dangerous. They do not come with noise. They do not come with warning. They do not even look like a problem at first. They enter quietly and they wait. And by the time they begin to manifest, you may no longer recognize where it started. This is where many people misunderstand their lives. They are waiting for something dramatic. They are expecting something obvious. But what if the real issue is not dramatic, but subtle, not immediate, but delayed, not violent, but strategic? There is a difference between something that attacks you openly and something that enters you quietly. One you will fight immediately. The other you may ignore. And that is the danger. Because anything that is not confronted is allowed to grow. There are problems that shout, and there are problems that whisper. And strangely, the ones that whisper often go deeper. This is why understanding is critical, because if you misdiagnose the nature of a problem, you will apply the wrong response, and the wrong response sustains the problem. There is a kind of attack that does not look like destruction at first. It looks like distraction, it looks like delay, it looks like misdirection, but underneath, something is happening, slowly, quietly, systematically. And this is where many lives are altered, not in a moment, but over time. You may still be active, but not effective. You may still be moving, but in the wrong direction. You may still be achieving, but not what truly matters. And one day, you look back and realize something has been off for a long time. Not broken, not collapsed, but misaligned. This is a kind of battle that requires attention, because it does not destroy loudly, it wastes quietly. And wasting is more dangerous than destruction. Destruction is visible. Waste is hidden. Destruction forces reaction. Waste delays awareness. And this is why some people do not realize what is happening until much later, until opportunities have passed, until time has been lost, until energy has been invested in the wrong direction. And then the question begins to rise. How did I get here? But the answer is not always in one event. Sometimes it is in a process, a slow process, a subtle process, a process that began long before the manifestation. And this is where we must become honest. Are we dealing with what is obvious, or are we ignoring what is subtle? Are we responding to symptoms, or are we discerning patterns? Because if something has entered quietly, it must be addressed intentionally, not emotionally, not fearfully, but clearly. There is also something else to understand. Not everything that feels harmless is harmless. Some things look small, but carry long-term impact. Some habits look innocent, but create internal shifts. Some influences feel normal, but gradually reshape direction. And over time, these small things become structural, not overnight, but consistently. This is why awareness must increase, not suspicion, not fear, but awareness. To recognize that life is not always shaped by what is loud, but often by what is repeated quietly. So now the question becomes personal. What has entered your life quietly that you have not examined? What has been repeating that you have accepted as normal? What feels harmless but may be redirecting your path? Because the danger is not always in what attacks you openly. Sometimes it is in what you never thought to question. There are attacks that come like a serpent, And there are attacks that come like a scorpion. Both are dangerous, both are real, but they do not work the same way. And if you do not understand the difference, you may spend all your strength fighting one kind of problem while another kind is already working inside you. A serpent is easier to notice. It threatens openly. It creates fear quickly. It provokes immediate reaction. When something serpent-like enters a life, the disturbance is visible. The conflict is clear. The pressure is obvious. You know something is wrong, and because you know it, you begin to respond. You become alert. You become defensive. You begin to pray because the danger is visible, but the scorpion is different. The scorpion does not always announce itself with visible chaos. It enters quietly. It strikes subtly. It often leaves behind something delayed, and that is what makes it so dangerous. The serpent terrifies. The scorpion infiltrates. The serpent makes you panic. The scorpion makes you underestimate. The serpent feels like war. The scorpion feels like nothing happened at first. And many lives have been damaged not because they did not survive obvious warfare, but because they ignore subtle poison. This is where spiritual discernment becomes absolutely necessary. Because some people are waiting for loud battles while silent damage is already unfolding. They are expecting a visible collapse, but the problem is not collapse yet. It is contamination. It is possible to keep functioning while something destructive has already entered your system. It is possible to smile, work, plan, travel, build, even pray, while something hidden is waiting for the right season to manifest. And because there is no immediate explosion, a person assumes there is no danger. But delayed manifestation does not mean absent danger. In fact, some of the most painful forms of disruption in life are not sudden. They are timed. They wait until the age of marriage. They wait until the day of celebration. They wait until the hour of promotion. They wait until a door begins to open, and then they strike. That is why not every battle is about open resistance. Some battles are about hidden timing. Some attacks are designed not merely to wound, but to wait. Not merely to oppose, but to spoil key moments. Not merely to trouble a person, but to poison transitions. And this is why many people become confused. They say everything was going well. I do not understand what happened. It looked promising. It seemed close. Exactly. That is often how subtle destruction works. It does not always confront the beginning. It waits for the threshold. It waits for visibility. It waits for the point where loss will hurt more deeply. So when Jesus speaks of serpents and scorpions, this is not empty symbolism. It is a serious unveiling of how evil operates. Some powers are aggressive and immediate. Others are quiet, strategic, and delayed. Some attack by force, others attack by penetration. Some try to stop you in public. Others try to weaken you in secret until you sabotage yourself, misread opportunities, waste strength, or arrive at the wrong destination with great effort. And this is the tragedy of the scorpion-like attack. A person may still be active, but the activity begins to drift away from purpose. Busy, but not fruitful. Gifted, but misdirected. Capable, but attached to the wrong things. Hardworking, but climbing the wrong wall. This is why subtle warfare is so devastating. It does not always remove your energy. Sometimes it redirects it. It lets you keep running, but not toward what matters. It lets you stay committed, but to the wrong pursuit. It lets you stay passionate, but without discernment. And a person can lose years that way, not because they were lazy, not because they lack ability, but because something hidden had interfered with direction. This is why every serious believer must ask deeper questions. Not just, am I under attack? But what kind of attack is this? Is this open resistance that must be confronted directly? Or is this subtle poison that must be exposed before it manifests further. Because if you treat subtle poison like visible conflict, you may miss the root of the issue. The scorpion also represents something cold, something calculating, something without mercy or emotion. There are attacks in life that do not come with rage at first. They come with calculation. They study timing. They exploit carelessness. They walk through compromise, distraction, secret appetites, hidden openings, delayed consequences, and private agreements. That is why the spiritually careless person is vulnerable not only to obvious temptation, but to subtle infiltration. A little compromise here, a little secrecy there, a little falsehood, a little indulgence, a little spiritual sleep. And soon, what looks small begins to alter the course of a life. This is how people end up strong in the wrong places and weak in the places that matter most. This is how people become highly skilled but deeply unstable. This is how people appear successful but inwardly misaligned. This is how people carry great potential yet repeatedly lose what should have become lasting fruit. The issue is not always lack of effort. Sometimes the issue is hidden venom. Something entered, and though the person kept moving, the inner consequence kept spreading. That is why prayer cannot be casual in seasons like this. You do not casually deal with subtle destruction. You ask God for light. You ask Him to reveal what entered unnoticed. You ask Him to expose what has been feeding delay, misdirection, confusion, false attachment, strange patterns, private weakness, or recurring disappointment. Because once subtle poison is exposed, it can be confronted. And this is the hope in the middle of the warning. What is subtle to you is not subtle to God. He sees what entered, He sees when it entered, He sees where it hid, He sees how it has tried to walk. Nothing buried is hidden from Him. Nothing delayed is beyond His reach. Nothing subtle is too clever for His light. The problem is not that God cannot see. The problem is that many people do not ask Him to show them what they have been ignoring. So now let the question come closer. Are you fighting only what is obvious while something subtle remains active? Have you mistaken delayed manifestation for no danger? Have you been busy but possibly misdirected? Have you been treating surface conflict while hidden contamination remains unchallenged? Because this is where awakening deepens. Not when you become afraid, but when you become clear. And once clarity comes, you can no longer afford to live carelessly. If the serpent represents visible conflict, then the scorpion represents invisible corruption. And the most dangerous thing about corruption is this: it does not need to destroy you immediately. It only needs to alter you gradually. Because once something inside you is altered, your decisions begin to change. Your direction begins to shift. Your outcomes begin to follow. This is what the venom really represents. Not just an attack, but an internal effect. Something that enters and then begins to influence from within. And here is where many people miss it. They are looking for external enemies, while the real damage is already internal. The venom is not always seen, but it is expressed. Not immediately, but eventually. You begin to notice strange patterns. You make decisions that do not match your wisdom. You choose paths that do not align with your purpose. You commit energy to things that do not produce real results. And over time, something feels off, but not enough to stop you. And that is the trap. Because the scorpion does not paralyze you instantly. It allows you to keep moving, but incorrectly. This is why some people are not stagnant, but still not progressing. They are active. They are trying. They are doing many things, but the outcomes do not match the effort. And that is a sign. Not always, but often. Because when effort and outcome consistently do not align, something deeper must be examined. The venom begins to show itself in subtle ways. Persistent delay without clear cause. repeated near success that never completes, attraction to the wrong opportunities, disconnection from the right ones. You start strong, but you do not finish well. You get close, but something always shifts. You invest, but the return is missing. This is not always coincidence. Sometimes it is interference. And interference is rarely loud. It is quiet. It walks through misjudgment. It walks through distraction. It walks through wrong timing. It walks through misplaced trust. You meet the wrong person at the right time or the right person at the wrong time. You enter something that looks promising but drains you later. You avoid something that felt uncertain but was actually necessary. And after a while, you begin to notice a pattern. I keep ending up in the wrong place. I keep missing what matters. I keep starting over. And this is where frustration grows. But frustration alone does not solve anything, because the issue is not effort. The issue is influence. Something is influencing direction. And until that influence is addressed, the pattern continues. There is also another dimension of this venom. It can affect perception. You begin to see incorrectly, not completely blind, but slightly off. And slightly off is enough to create major consequences over time, because small misalignment repeated consistently become large deviations. A small wrong decision repeated over years can redirect an entire life. This is why subtle interference is so dangerous. It does not need to control everything. It only needs to influence enough to shift direction, enough to affect timing, enough to alter perception. And from there, everything else follows. There is also the emotional dimension. You may find yourself reacting in ways that are not fully yours. Unusual irritation, unexplained discouragement, loss of clarity, loss of motivation at critical moments. You want to move forward, but something pulls you back. Not strongly, but consistently. And consistency is what builds patterns. This is how people begin to doubt themselves. Not because they lack ability, but because something keeps interrupting their flow. And over time, that interruption becomes normal. And once it becomes normal, it is no longer questioned. That is the real danger. When something abnormal becomes accepted, when misalignment becomes familiar, when dysfunction becomes routine, at that point, the venom has done its work. But here is the truth. What has been influencing you can be exposed. And what is exposed can be addressed. This is where awareness becomes power. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a practical one. Because once you see clearly, you can begin to choose differently. You begin to question patterns, you begin to interrupt cycles, you begin to realign decisions, and slowly something begins to shift. Not instantly, but progressively. The same way the venom walks slowly, clarity begins to walk steadily. This is why you must not ignore repeated patterns. Anything that repeats without clear reason deserves attention. Anything that consistently misaligns your direction must be examined. Anything that keeps delaying what should move forward must be confronted with clarity. Not fearfully, but intentionally. Because ignoring it will not stop it. But understanding it is the beginning of breaking it. So now ask yourself honestly, where have I been active but not effective? Where have I been consistent but misdirected? Where have I repeated outcomes that do not match my effort? And could it be that something subtle has been influencing more than I realize? Because once that question is asked sincerely, you are no longer asleep to the pattern. And once you are no longer asleep, change can begin. If something has entered quietly, then it must be sustained somehow. Nothing continues without support. No pattern survives without reinforcement. No influence remains active without a channel. So the question is no longer just what entered. The deeper question is what is allowing it to stay? Because subtle problems rarely stand alone. They connect, they attach, they find points of agreement. And often those points are not external, they are internal. There are certain conditions within a person that make subtle interference easier to sustain. Not because the person is weak, but because something inside has not been aligned, corrected, or guarded. These are not always obvious. They are not always dramatic, but they are powerful. Think of them like entry points or stabilizers. If they remain active, they give structure to what should have been temporary. One of the most common is fear. Not loud fear, not panic, but quiet expectation of negative outcomes. You try something, but internally expect it to fail. You move forward, but anticipate disappointment. And over time, that expectation begins to shape behavior. You hold back, you hesitate, you overthink, and slowly fear begins to influence direction, not by force, but by suggestion. Another is unbelief, not in the sense of denial, but in the sense of internal inconsistency. You say you believe, but you do not fully expect results. You act, but without confidence in outcome. And that internal contradiction creates instability, because alignment requires consistency. If what you say and what you expect do not match, your direction weakens. Then there is compromise, not always visible, not always extreme, but present. Small allowances, small justifications, small things you know are not right, but choose not to address. And over time, those small things become normal. And once they become normal, they stop being questioned. But what is not questioned is not corrected. There is also misdirected desire, wanting things but not discerning their impact, pursuing opportunities without understanding their cost. And this leads to misplaced investment. You give time to what drains you. You attach to what does not align. You commit to what eventually redirects you. And slowly your path shifts. Not suddenly, but steadily. There is also the issue of internal noise. Too many influences, too many voices, too many distractions. And when the inner life is crowded, clarity is lost. You react more than you reflect. You follow impulses instead of direction. And subtle interference thrives in confusion, because confusion delays decision. And delayed decisions allow patterns to continue. There is also dishonesty, not just outward, but inward. Ignoring what you already know, avoiding truths that require change. And this creates a gap between reality and perception. You think you are aligned, but something inside knows you are not. And that inner contradiction weakens stability, because truth ignored does not disappear. It remains and influences quietly. These are not random issues. They are connectors. They give structure to patterns that should have ended. They allow something subtle to remain active longer than it should. This is why deep change is not only about confronting what is outside, it is about correcting what is inside. Not harshly, not emotionally, but honestly. Because honesty restores alignment. And alignment removes support from what should not remain. There is also something important to understand. You do not have to fix everything at once. That is not how change works. Change begins with recognition, seeing clearly what has been ignored, acknowledging what has been tolerated, and then making adjustments, one area at a time, consistently. Because consistency breaks patterns, not intensity, not sudden effort, but repeated alignment. There is also the matter of responsibility, not blame, responsibility. To recognize that even if something enters without your awareness, It cannot continue without some level of cooperation. And once you remove that cooperation, it begins to weaken. This is where power returns. Not dramatic power, but practical control. You begin to choose differently. You begin to respond differently. You begin to interrupt what used to repeat automatically. And slowly, something shifts. Not because everything changed at once, but because something inside is no longer supporting what should not remain. So now the question becomes clear. What has been sustaining what you want to end? What internal patterns have been giving strength to external outcomes? What have you allowed to remain that needs to be corrected? Because once support is removed, what once looked strong begins to collapse. There is a moment in every serious transformation where awareness is no longer enough. You have seen the pattern. You have understood the cause. You have recognized what has been influencing your life, but nothing truly changes until you decide, not casually, not emotionally, but decisively. Because there are things in life that will not live simply because you understand them. They remain until they are confronted. And confrontation is not noise. It is clarity with commitment. It is the moment you stop negotiating with what you already know is wrong. It is the moment you stop tolerating what you have already identified. It is the moment you draw a line not outwardly first but inwardly. A line that says this will not continue. Not because you feel strong, but because you have become clear, and clarity produces firmness. This is where many people hesitate. They understand but delay action. They recognize but postpone decision. And that delay gives space for the pattern to continue. Because anything not resisted remains. There are patterns that do not need your permission to start, but they do need your cooperation to continue. And cooperation is often subtle, returning to old habits, entertaining familiar thoughts, allowing the same reactions. And each time you return, you reinforce. This is why confrontation must be consistent, not one time, not occasional, but sustained, because patterns are not broken in a moment. They are weakened through repeated interruption. You interrupt the thought, you interrupt the behavior, you interrupt the reaction again and again and again until what used to feel automatic no longer feels natural. This is the process, not dramatic, but powerful. There is also something important about intensity. Many people think confrontation means aggression, but aggression without direction is useless. True confrontation is precise. You know what you are addressing. You know why you are addressing it. And you remain consistent. You are not reacting to everything. You are dealing with something specific. This is what makes it effective. There is also the matter of authority, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. The authority to choose differently, the authority to say no to what you previously allowed, the authority to stop repeating what you now understand, and this authority grows with use. The more you act on clarity, the stronger it becomes. The more you hesitate, the weaker it feels. So strength is not something you wait for. It is something you build through action. There is also resistance at this stage because anything that has operated for a long time will not disappear quietly. It will attempt to return, not dramatically, but subtly, through familiar thoughts, through emotional triggers, through internal pressure. And this is where many people misinterpret the process. They think it's not working. It's still there. But what they are experiencing is not failure. It is resistance. And resistance means something is changing. Because what is stable does not resist. It continues. But what is being challenged reacts. So when resistance appears, the response is not retreat. It is consistency. You continue to interrupt. You continue to choose differently. You continue to remain aligned until the pattern weakens. And it will, because patterns cannot survive without reinforcement. Remove reinforcement and they collapse. There is also something else to understand. You do not need to feel ready to act. Waiting to feel ready often delays change. Clarity is enough. If you see it clearly, you can begin. Even if it feels uncomfortable, even if it requires effort, because growth is rarely comfortable, but it is always necessary. There is also the role of discipline, not harsh discipline, but steady discipline, doing what aligns even when it is not convenient, choosing correctly even when the old pattern feels easier. And over time, this discipline becomes natural. What once felt difficult becomes default. What once required effort becomes automatic. And this is how transformation stabilizes. Not in one moment, but in repeated action. There is also something deeply empowering about this stage. You begin to realize you are not stuck. Not because everything changed instantly, but because you are no longer passive. You are participating, you are choosing, you are acting. And that changes everything. Because once you are no longer passive, patterns lose their advantage. So now the question becomes direct. Where have you delayed action, even though you understand? Where have you allowed something to continue simply because you did not decide? Where do you need to move from awareness to action? Because this is the turning point. Not when you learn more, but when you act on what you already know. There is a moment where understanding must become action, not abstract action, not emotional reaction, but intentional engagement. Because clarity without engagement changes nothing. And this is where many people stop too early. They have insight, but no application. They have awareness, but no structure. And without structure, change cannot hold. This is where disciplined response becomes essential, not as a performance, not as a ritual, but as alignment expressed through action. There is a difference between reacting occasionally and responding consistently. Occasional reaction brings temporary relief. Consistent response produces lasting change. So what does engagement look like in a practical sense? It begins with attention. You begin to notice when patterns attempt to repeat. You become aware of triggers. You recognize early signs before the pattern completes. This is critical because once a pattern completes, it reinforces itself. But if you interrupt it early, you weaken it. So attention becomes your first tool, not anxiety attention. Calm awareness. Seeing clearly what is happening as it happens. Then comes interruption. When the familiar thought appears, you stop it. When the old reaction rises, you redirect it. When the impulse pushes, you pause. Not dramatically, but deliberately. And this interruption breaks the automatic cycle. There is also replacement because you cannot remove a pattern without replacing it. If you stop one behavior but leave a gap, the old pattern returns. So you replace old thoughts with clearer ones, old reactions with intentional responses, old habits with aligned actions, and over time the new pattern stabilizes. This is how change becomes sustainable, not by removal alone, but by replacement. There is also the role of consistency, not intensity, consistency, doing the right thing repeatedly, even when it feels small, even when it feels slow, because repetition builds structure, and structure stabilizes change. This is where many underestimate the process. They expect transformation to feel dramatic, but most real transformation is quiet, subtle shift, repeated choices, steady alignment, and over time, those quiet changes become powerful. There is also something important about environment, because patterns are influenced by surroundings. What you expose yourself to, what you listen to, what you allow into your space. These things matter, not in an extreme way, but in a consistent way. If your environment reinforces old patterns, your effort must be stronger. But if your environment supports new alignment, change becomes easier. So adjustment is necessary. Not total isolation, but intentional selection. Choosing what supports clarity and reducing what sustains confusion. There is also the role of reflection. Taking time to evaluate what is changing, what is improving, what still needs attention. Because reflection keeps you aware and awareness keeps you aligned. Without reflection, patterns can return unnoticed. But with reflection, you stay ahead. There is also something deeply practical about this stage. You begin to trust the process, not blindly, but through experience. You see small changes, you notice improved decisions, you recognize increased clarity, and this builds confidence, not in a dramatic sense, but in a steady one. You begin to realize, I can change this, I can interrupt this, I can realign this. And that realization is powerful because it removes helplessness. There is also patience, because not everything shifts immediately. Some patterns are deeply established, and deeply established patterns require sustained effort. But sustained effort produces results, not instantly, but inevitably. This is where many give up too early. They expect immediate transformation, and when it does not happen, they stop. But stopping interrupts progress, and progress requires continuation. So patience is not passive, it is active persistence. Continuing to align, continuing to act, continuing to adjust until change becomes stable. There is also something important to remember. You are not trying to become perfect, you are trying to become aligned. And alignment is a process, a continuous process, not a one-time event. So now the question becomes, are you willing to engage consistently, not just understand? Are you willing to interrupt patterns, not just recognize them? Are you willing to build new structure, not just remove old habits? Because this is where transformation becomes real, not in insight, but in practice. There comes a moment where everything becomes simple, not easy, but simple. You have seen enough, you have understood enough, you have tried enough, and something inside you settles into a quiet conclusion. This cannot continue. Not loudly, not emotionally, but firmly. This is what many people call a turning point, but it does not always feel dramatic. It feels clear. It feels settled. It feels final in a way that does not need announcement, because something inside has decided, not temporarily, not conditionally, but completely. And this is where real change begins. Not when you feel inspired, not when everything is comfortable, but when you become resolved, because resolution removes negotiation. Before this moment, you may have been negotiating, I will try. I will see how it goes. I will change if it gets worse. But after this moment, there is no negotiation. There is direction. And direction simplifies everything. You no longer ask, should I go back? You no longer debate, is this really a problem? You already know. And because you know, you act accordingly. This is where many people experience what feels like breakthrough. Not because something external suddenly changed, but because something internal became unshakable. Clarity turned into conviction, and conviction is powerful. Because once conviction is established, your behavior begins to follow without constant struggle. You no longer need to force yourself repeatedly. You simply do what aligns because you have decided. There is also a quiet strength in this stage, not visible strength, but stable strength. You are no longer easily pulled by old patterns. You are no longer easily distracted by familiar impulses. Not because they disappeared, but because they no longer control your direction. They may still appear, but they do not lead. And that is freedom. Not the absence of challenge, but the absence of control by what used to dominate. There is also something else that happens here. You begin to recognize yourself differently, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady awareness. I'm not who I was in that pattern. I do not respond the same way anymore. I do not think the same way anymore. And this recognition reinforces change, because identity influences behavior. And when identity shifts, behavior stabilizes. There is also endurance in this stage, because even after decision, there will still be moments of testing. Old patterns may try to reappear. Old thoughts may attempt to return. But now, the response is different. Not panic, not confusion, but calm refusal. You see it and you do not follow it. You recognize it and you do not engage it. And this repeated refusal weakens what once felt strong. This is how cycles end. Not in one dramatic break, but in repeated non-cooperation. Every time you do not return, you break the cycle further. Every time you choose differently, you reinforce the new path. And over time, the old pattern loses its structure completely. There is also peace in this stage, not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer divided. Before, there was conflict inside. You knew but did not act. You saw but hesitated. Now, there is alignment. What you see, you act on. What you understand, you follow. And that alignment brings stability. There is also a future implication here, because once a pattern is broken, it does not only affect your present, it changes what comes next. Decisions improve, timing aligns, opportunities are recognized correctly, not because life became easier, but because you became clearer, and clarity changes outcomes. There is also something deeply important to say here. You do not need to announce your change. You do not need to prove it to anyone. Real transformation is not loud, it is consistent. It shows over time, in your choices, in your direction, in your results. And those results speak, not immediately, but inevitably. So now, at this point, everything becomes very direct. What have you now clearly seen that you can no longer ignore? What have you finally decided that will not continue? What are you now committed to, regardless of how it feels? Because this is the moment. Not emotional, but decisive. Not temporary, but stable. And from this point forward, something changes. Not all at once, but permanently. Because you are no longer negotiating, you are moving. There is something sobering about reaching the end of a moment like this. Not because everything has been solved, but because everything has been revealed. You have seen patterns. You have understood influences. You have recognized what has been working quietly beneath the surface. And now you cannot unknow it. This is where responsibility begins. Not pressure, not fear. Responsibility. Because once clarity comes, neutrality is no longer possible. You will either act on what you now understand or slowly return to what you have just recognized. There is no middle ground. And this is where many people make a quiet decision sometimes without realizing it. They feel something shift while listening. They sense something real. They even agree internally, but then they go back unchanged. Not because they rejected truth, but because they did not act on it. And over time, that ignored clarity fades. Not immediately, but gradually, until what once felt urgent becomes distant again. This is why this moment matters, because it is not about emotion, it is about direction. You are not here to feel something, you are here to decide something. And decision is powerful. A quiet, firm decision can redirect years, not instantly, but steadily. There is also something important to understand. Transformation is not a single moment. It is a series of consistent decisions. You decide once, and then you support that decision daily. In your thoughts, in your actions, in your responses. And over time, the decision becomes your new normal. This is how real change happens, not in one breakthrough moment, but in sustained alignment. There is also vigilance, because once something begins to change, there is a tendency to relax too early, to assume it is finished, to assume it will stay that way automatically. But anything not maintained can return. Not because it is stronger, but because attention shifted. So awareness must remain, not as tension, but as clarity. A steady awareness of what has changed and what must not return. There is also hope in this. Real hope. Not emotional encouragement, but grounded truth. Because no matter how long something has been operating, it is not beyond change. Not because it is weak, but because it is not permanent. Patterns feel permanent when they repeat. But repetition is not permanence. It is simply consistency, and what was built through consistency can be broken through consistency. There is also a feature waiting on your alignment. Not a perfect feature, but a clearer one, a more stable one, a more accurate reflection of who you are meant to become. And that feature is not reached by chance. It is reached by direction, by choosing differently, by acting consistently, by refusing to return. There's also something deeply personal about this ending. No one can do this for you. They can guide you. They can explain. They can show you patterns, but the decision is yours. The consistency is yours. The responsibility is yours. And that is not a burden, it is power. Because it means your life is not fixed. It means your direction is not locked. It means change is not outside your reach. So now, before this moment closes, ask yourself honestly, what will I no longer ignore? What will I no longer tolerate? What will I begin to change starting now? Not tomorrow, not later, now. Because the difference between people who remain in patterns and those who break them is not knowledge. It is decision followed by action. So take that decision seriously, hold it firmly, support it daily, and over time, you will see something happen. Not suddenly, but undeniably, you will become different. And when you become different, your life follows.